We're proud to support the craft of journalism. UBS brings you the latest news from around the world with The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Be part of an international network that brings together leading insights, research and technology across 24 time zones and 12 key financial hubs, with you at the centre of it all. UBS. Advice is our craft.
You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 7th of August 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. This is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead...
A tremendous number of Russian soldiers are being killed, and likewise Ukraine, a lower number, but still, it's a lot of people being killed in that ridiculous war.
Trump's secondary tariffs on countries trading with Russia are meant to come into effect in a couple of days. But will Turkey, which maintains relationships with both Kyiv and Moscow, be on the list? Spain has announced it's halting plans to buy US-made F-35 fighter jets. We'll ask why, and if this reflects a broader trend away from American military hardware. We'll have a look at what's making headlines internationally, and then we'll turn to Lebanon, where the cabinet is planning to disarm Hezbollah. What does this mean for the fractured nation? We'll take a deep dive into Japan's capsule toys and the exhibition that features the development of the industry over the last 60 years. Plus...
I'm Sheena Rossiter, a contributing editor in Canada, and today I'll be giving an update on the wildfires burning in southern France, and I'll be looking at a study that explains how chemical pollution is a threat that's comparable to climate change.
And finally, we'll look at how US attitudes are changing when it comes to work-life balance. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. President Donald Trump could meet Vladimir Putin as soon as next week, a White House official said yesterday. South Korea and the United States will conduct major joint military drills starting on August the 18th, but will delay parts of the annual exercises that have been a source of tension with North Korea. And France has been hit by the largest wildfire since 1949. Do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, tomorrow marks the deadline set by President Trump for secondary sanctions on countries importing Russian goods. India has already been slapped with a 25% increase, raising duties on some Indian exports to as high as 50%. That's amongst the highest levied on any US trading partner. China is also on the list, as is Turkey, the third largest importer of Russian goods when it comes to petroleum products. However, the country is one of the few nations to maintain direct ties with both Moscow and Kyiv. President Erdogan is a strong supporter of President Zelensky and has repeatedly attempted to foster peace talks between the warring parties. Well, I'm joined now from Kyiv by Monocle's Julia Jen and by Hannah Lucinda Smith, Monocle's Istanbul correspondent. Good morning to you both. Hannah, I wonder if we could start by you telling us the extent of Turkey's reliance on Russia for energy needs.
Yeah, good morning. Well, Turkey is an entirely energy-dependent country. It produces very, very, very small amount of its own energy, although it has got this kind of place as an energy transit country. And one of the main places that it does import, particularly gas from, is Russia. Now, that's one of the factors that meant that back in 2022, when the invasion of Ukraine happened and the sanctions really started coming down on Russia, that's why Turkey kind of declined to join. There's also other sources of income. A lot of the Russian oligarchs who'd been parking their super yachts in European ports moved into Turkey. Also, a lot of high-profile Russian businessmen, including reportedly Roman Abramovich, moving their businesses and their homes here to Turkey as well. So there's clearly been a real financial incentive, an economic incentive for Turkey to carry on doing business with Russia, particularly because Turkey is going through this really deep economic crisis of its own.
Is there any way that the Russian energy could be replaced by another supplier? What are Turkey's options?
Yeah, so, this is something that Turkey has been trying to do, and also another source of its energy is Iran. It's been trying to sort of wean itself off of the two. One alternative option is Azerbaijan, which is a major gas and petrol producer and also an extremely close ally of Turkey. But really, even though Azerbaijan, has a decent supply, it's not enough to replace Turkey's energy needs.
Let's cross to you, Julia, in Kyiv. How important is Turkey's support of Ukraine?
Well, good morning, Janina. So in the first few months of the full-scale invasion, Turkey was sort of celebrated in Ukraine. There were kind of folk songs about the drones that they were giving to Ukraine. There was this particular drone, the Bayraktar. So, that was immediately marked Turkey, as a very important ally for Ukrainians. And since then, we've seen that Turkey has been, much more than anywhere in the Middle East or anywhere in Europe. Turkey has been the kind of setting for all these peace talks that are going on. But I think for Ukrainians, this is a very difficult situation, especially on the front line, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But so in terms of international diplomacy, Ukrainians are sort of feeling quite exhausted, and it's quite a surreal feeling now walking around Kyiv, a change from London, where here in Kyiv you have this feeling that kind of these high-level meetings, people in Turkey or whatever, people kind of jetting around the globe, politicians talking to each other on over the phone, etc. You have this feeling that they're kind of having these conversations over your head, and then you've got this daily life. You're sort of trying to get by every day, trying to survive every day, make sure your family survives. So there's this kind of dissonance, definitely, in the feelings towards Turkey here.
And what we're waiting to see, of course, is whether it's enough in Trump's view, that Turkey's support of Ukraine is enough in Trump's view to head off those secondary sanctions for Erdogan's trade with Russia. Hannah, can we just talk a little bit about trade directly between Turkey and Ukraine? So we know that Zelensky's invited Erdogan to visit his country. That would be his first trip there since 2022. At the top of the agenda would be a free trade agreement. Those discussions have been going on for years. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. I think this is a really, really telling thing about this upcoming visit by Erdogan to Ukraine is that trade's at the top of the agenda. Russia's a massively important trade partner, and for Turkey, you mentioned at the top of the show, the third biggest trade partner. It's not just about energy. Also, Turkish agricultural exports. Russia's a major market. Turkey's tourism industry. Russians are, I believe, this year the biggest visitors, Russians or Germans. It's a huge relationship, and I think this really shows that Ukraine might be trying to offer a kind of alternative also for Ukrainians. Turkey, again, a big holiday destination, and as was mentioned, you have those kind of links with Bayraktar. What's really interesting, the Bayraktar drones, that's a company run by Erdogan's son-in-law Selçuk Bayraktar, who's been one of the major advocates for Ukraine, sort of within the palace. He's been one of the major voices trying to push Erdogan more towards supporting Ukraine. So I think, if substantial trade deals can be done, that might be something that sort of persuades Erdogan and his economic team to maybe join in with these sanctions this time round.
Julia, you mentioned the dissonance there for people on the ground. I wonder how this looming deadline has been covered in Ukraine. Is the media picking up on this?
Definitely, yes, of course. Everything that Trump says, every word is immediately streamed into everyone's phones, Telegram channels. Everyone's constantly keeping an eye on what the latest thing that's been said in sort of Western capitals or by Erdogan or whatever. And actually, just to that point that Erdogan, there was a notification a few days ago that, everyone got via news channels through their Telegram that Erdogan was supposedly supposed to visit Kyiv even later this week. And there was this kind of flurry of excitement. But there are also two very important, kind of things dominating the headlines here, one of which is the situation on the front line. And this is really where the eyes are in Ukraine right now. There's a city of Pokrovsk, which was not in danger. It's on the eastern side of Ukraine, and this wasn't in danger a year ago. Ukrainian soldiers were using this as a base, and life was very much continuing for residents there. And now it's very much in danger and potentially will be taken by the Russians in the next few days. It's a very unclear situation right now on the ground, but it's very difficult for the Ukrainian soldiers who are trying to hold the town. And tens of thousands of civilians have now been evacuated from there as the city basically prepares for occupation. So that's very much. And when we talk about, what Trump is talking about, what Erdogan is talking about, et cetera, people here in Ukraine really feel, well, that's not the focus. That shouldn't be the focus. The focus should be how the Russians are actually advancing. And sadly, the Ukrainian army's kind of weaknesses on the ground, on the front line. And this is a very big difficulty for people here. And that's something people have to grapple with here. Reality, for their relatives and who are from Pokrovsk or who are in the army, etc., on that particular front section of the front line. And these meetings, what effect will they have on the situation there? Will Ukraine lose more ground before a sort of ceasefire, a supposed ceasefire is reached? It's not clear, but Putin is very much trying to press ahead. There's a real feeling here that Putin is trying to press ahead as much as he can on the front line before any sort of agreement is reached with Trump or Zelensky or whoever.
Hannah, we're hearing reports now that Trump and Putin themselves might meet. I wonder if Moscow's ready for a ceasefire, or would this be contingent on Russia keeping annexed territories that Ukraine presumably wouldn't agree to? We don't know that this meeting is definitely going to happen, but surely that is on the table. And then that calls into question how Turkey navigates this fine balancing act between its military support of Ukraine and its significant ties to Russia.
Absolutely. And I think, the key thing for Turkey is Crimea. One of the reasons why Turkey is this kind of really steady backer of Ukraine, even if Erdogan continues to have a relationship with Putin, and there is economic cooperation carrying on between Turkey and Russia, is the fact that Crimea has this population of Crimean Tatars, who are a Turkic-speaking Muslim group, and in fact the Defence Minister of Ukraine, Rustem Umerov, is a Crimean Tatar. He's been one of the main kind of links between Turkey and Ukraine in the kind of talks over this war. So I think, for Turkey, Crimea could be a red line. It's always been really, really insistent from the start, since 2014 and the Russian annexation, that it views Crimea as part of Ukraine. That's not going to change. So I think, if the kind of formalisation of the annexation of Crimea, it continues to be a condition, I think it's going to be very, very hard for Turkey to keep finding a path through this.
Hannah, thank you very much indeed. That's our correspondent in Istanbul, Hannah Lucinda Smith, and also Monocle's Julia Jen, who is in Kyiv. This is The Globalist. 12 minutes past 8 in Madrid, 7:12 here in London. Spain is increasing defence spending to 2%, the current Nato target, but not, as demanded by Donald Trump, to 5%. The country's also announced it's abandoning plans to buy F-35 fighter jets from the US. Well, are these two decisions related? I'm joined now by Air Marshal Greg Bagwell, who's a former Deputy Commander of the Royal Air Force, currently a Distinguished Fellow with RUSI in London. Many thanks for coming on the show. What do we know about this turn from US-made fighter jets? Was there a deal already in place?
Yeah, good morning. I'm not sure that certainly wasn't a contract in place, but the Spanish had made their intention clear to buy up to 50 of these aircraft, two different variants, as it turns out. And they had the money allegedly put aside for that purchase. So now they're looking elsewhere with that money.
And so the F-35 is manufactured by the US company Lockheed Martin. Has the company said anything about this?
No, I don't think they have. And I think Lockheed Martin would probably stay fairly quiet in this. I mean, this is clearly a political choice, or it certainly appears to be, probably driven by a few things. One is Spain has been perhaps one of the slowest to reach NATO targets, and clearly this time is not making any guarantees to reach the 5% target that NATO have now agreed. So there's an element there of falling out perhaps with America, and that then causes them some concerns. And there is also the concerns about buying from America for some countries. There are concerns about what that might mean in terms of sovereignty. And for Spain, of course, they've got their own aviation industry. They may be looking to stay within programs that they benefit far greater from their own internal growth.
Well, let's look at the alternatives. If you're not buying from US companies, where are you getting your military aircraft from?
So a little bit of a teach-in here. There are generations of these types of aircraft. The aircraft they currently use, an F-18, the Eurofighter and the AV-8B Harrier, is what's known as a fourth generation aircraft. The F-35s are currently the world's only fifth, well, certainly in the West, fifth generation aircraft. And that's what they would have been doing. They would have been upgrading from fourth to fifth generation. There are new aeroplanes coming online, both within Europe and the UK, that are what's known as sixth generation. And it appears that Spain will now be looking at a combination of buying some more of what they already have, like Eurofighter, and possibly more of the future aircraft, which could be the European, what's known as FCAS, or possibly even the UK version known as Tempest.
I wonder if this reflects a broader trend in military hardware sourcing across Europe, and if it matters politically or militarily where the aircraft come from.
It does matter. I mean, obviously, it matters in the sense of how you're bound into the alliance and how your relations are with those countries in terms of guarantee of supply. But there's other factors as well, which is your own internal aerospace industry and where you get most benefit. Most countries will try and manufacture as much as they can in their own country for obvious reasons. And in the case of Spain, that would be through the Eurofighter program, where they're a fundamental partner.
I mean, is it important that European countries stop buying US manufactured hardware?
No, and you look across the rest of Europe, most other countries have bought the F-35 and have continued to do so despite some of the noise in the political space. So there's nobody at the moment running for the exit. Spain, if you like, is the first one to break cover. And I think that will send ripples through the political system and through the aerospace world. But at the moment, I think everyone's holding pretty steady. The American defense industries are well interwoven into Europe and the UK especially. And I think there is a strong desire to maintain that strong relationship.
And is it important in terms of sort of interoperability, particularly with NATO joint ops?
It does help. Obviously, if you buy the same thing, then they're almost interoperable from the outset. The great thing about the NATO alliance is it has a set of rules and standards that ensures that everyone's interoperable no matter what you buy, and that does then change the specification of certain systems. But NATO as an alliance is an extremely good one at maintaining interoperability, and whatever Spain may buy will remain integrated within the NATO air forces.
The UK is still buying military jets from the US, and they are stored or will be stored, the next lot, at RAF Markham. That's the site from which the UK's own air-launched nuclear weapons were based before being decommissioned in 1988. Do you think that will be reversed, that the UK will want to have that capability once again?
Yes, RAF Marham in Norfolk. We had a number of bases that housed nuclear weapons during the Cold War. I myself was based on one in my past. Yes, the government had talked about the potential for the new model of F-35, the F-35A, to have that nuclear role. There's been no discussion, and nor probably will there be, on how many of those weapons we will either have in possession or where they may be stored. The weapon that currently is paired with that aircraft is an American weapon, and therefore there'll be some joint custodianship issues anyway.
How useful is it militarily to store nuclear weapons? Should the process to host nuclear weapons begin again? Would this be more of a political gesture?
It's not necessarily about the storing of the weapon. Nobody declares where they hold their weapons for obvious reasons, and certainly tries to keep it as classified as possible. It is about having a credible deterrence. And one of the reasons that the UK has gone down this route is, up until now, we've put all our eggs, if you like, in one basket, which is with the nuclear deterrent on the continuous at sea deterrent submarines. And what this does, it adds another string to the bow, if you like, and particularly with Russia being particularly noisy around the nuclear space vis-a-vis Ukraine. And all it's designed to do is to keep Russia honest and to deter the use of any nuclear weapons. So in theory, it makes us safer. Now, I know that's hard for some people to understand with nuclear weapons, particularly after yesterday's anniversary. But the idea of deterrence is that you deter someone else from using something because they know what they're going to get coming back.
Greg, thank you very much indeed. That's Air Marshal Greg Bagwell of Russi there. Now, still to come on the programme.
The Gacha Gacha exhibition stems from my desire to pass down this Gacha Gacha culture, which has now become part of Japanese culture, to future generations.
We learn about the history of capsule toys, still alive and well in Japan. This is The Globalist.
Craft is its own reward, which is why at UBS we're honoured to work alongside over 50 of today's leading Nobel laureates, each an expert in the art of economic science, bringing you engaging discussions, actionable insights and inspired solutions, all focused around the questions that shape our world today. For a better outlook, find a Nobel perspective. UBS. Banking is our craft.
Let's continue now with today's newspapers. And joining me in the studio is Charles Hecker, Russia analyst and author of Zero Sum, The Arc of International Business in Russia. Good morning to you, Charles.
Good morning, Georgina.
Now, we've obviously been talking about Trump and Putin and this possible meeting. How is this being reported?
That's right. As you mentioned at the top of the broadcast, and as you touched on in your discussion of Russia and Turkey, the papers all around the world, we're going to start with the Times of London, but the papers all around the world lead with a story about the potential of a meeting between President Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, and then the potential meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky, and then a hint, perhaps, that all three at some point could meet. And this is meant to be a major breakthrough or a potential breakthrough in discussions on the war on Ukraine. Georgina, I think we have to approach the story with a certain element of skepticism. Nothing really in the fundamentals of this conflict and in the major parties to the conflict has changed. We had Witkoff coming back, the U.S. Special Envoy to the Middle East and to Russia. Steve Witkoff just came back from his 5th trip to Moscow. All of his preceding trips have failed to produce diplomatic breakthroughs. There have been some hostage exchanges arranged as a result of his visits to Moscow, but no breakthroughs in the conflict. The noise that came out of yesterday's meeting in Moscow, Witkoff met with Putin face to face. The noise coming out of there was absolutely sort of neutral and didn't seem to even hint at anything new or different happening in the conflict. So I think we've got to be skeptical about the likelihood of these meetings, number one, happening, and number two, actually producing anything meaningful towards the end of the conflict.
Yeah. Of course, Russia might be driven by the fact that there will be secondary tariffs placed on various people that buy Russian goods. And of course, those tariffs begin today. But one wonders if Russia, in terms of any kind of agreement, again, as we were discussing earlier, they're going to absolutely insist on holding on to land.
That's right. So, the number one area of disagreement and an area that shows no sign of compromise is Putin's insistence on staying in the parts of Ukraine that Russia has taken militarily and administratively by annexation, and Zelensky's insistence on the withdrawal of Russian troops from precisely those same territories. No matter what is happening on the Russian side of the story, which is sort of economic pressure and sort of military hardships, and on the Ukrainian side, which is sort of the same, nothing seems to have moved on this singular topic of territorial gains and their relinquishment. So the other thing I suppose that we have to bear in mind that makes this a very difficult proposition is that we tend to think of a meeting between these leaders as the end of the story. And actually, we need to remind ourselves that this is the beginning of what will be a very long and drawn-out process. Nothing ends with these leaders coming together. It only just gets started.
Yeah, absolutely. Quick look at global tariffs, because, of course, they came into effect for over 90 countries at midnight.
That's right. We're going to the New York Times, which really sort of blasts the beginning of the Trump tariff regime across its front page. And in fact, what's interesting about this is that the New York Times is discussing this as the start of a trade war. We were thinking that some of the trade deals that have been negotiated prior to the launch of this global tariff regime would help relieve the likelihood of a trade war. But the New York Times is sort of saying that today is basically day one of a global trade war. Two things to point to specifically in this new economic regime, and that is Switzerland and India. Switzerland is facing an almost record-breaking globally 39% tariff. And the president of Switzerland, Karen Keller-Sutter, traveled to D.C. Just the other day, I think it was yesterday, met with Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, which is a little bit strange because the State Department is not the part of the American government that's deploying these tariffs. She went back to Switzerland empty-handed, without anything to show for her day in Washington. So Switzerland's goods and Switzerland's services, more importantly, will be subject to 39% tariffs. The other real headline here is India. India was starting out at a 25% tariff. Trump doubled that to 50% as a way of punishing India for buying Russian oil. So as the world adjusts to this new regime, and some companies are saying that they won't survive, there are a couple of countries that we really do need to focus on.
Absolutely. Now, I've absolutely no idea how to do an elegant segue from Donald Trump to Brazilian butt lifts, but I'm quite sure that listeners can come up with their own way to get there. But do tell us about Brazilian butt lifts.
With great pleasure. Georgina, August used to be known as the silly season in the news business because there really wasn't that much to talk about. And given what we've just talked about, there's very little to be silly about these days. But I came across a headline in The Guardian, including the phrase Brazilian butt lifts, and I thought that might be a sort of humorous thing to discuss. And by the way, the rest of the global media is obsessed with this process, and rival networks, who shall remain nameless, this morning were repeating the phrase Brazilian butt lift over and over and over again on national airwaves. What The Guardian is telling us is that the British government is cracking down on this and other unregulated cosmetic procedures. And Georgina, it's a little bit astonishing to learn that you can have dramatically body-altering procedures done on oneself without any real medical or regulatory oversight. And this includes the injection of heaven knows what into your hindquarters. It includes Botox. It includes fillers. It includes all sorts of dermatological and other cosmetic procedures done, including on people who are younger than 18 years old, with zero medical or official oversight.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? Extraordinary.
It really is.
As you say, the silly season and the party season too, the summer work party. Now, Stephen Bush in the FT, normally writing more serious stuff, is talking about how to have a good office party.
Well, that's right. And, I really need to, we both need to hang out with Stephen Bush a little bit more, Georgina, because he's going to summer office parties. And I sort of thought that summer office parties had gone the way of executive car allowances, and that is onto the sort of rubbish heap of expenses once we once loved. Stephen Bush, who's a columnist at the Financial Times, has a few very important pieces of advice for people who are going to summer work parties. Some of them are quite practical, others are a little bit more philosophical. On the practical side, Stephen advises everyone going to a summer work party to have a meal before you get there. And so, presumably this is a way of absorbing the alcohol that you're going to imbibe at a summer work party. If you can't do that, Stephen says, you must immediately book dinner upon departing the work party so that you absorb the alcohol at least post factum. One of the more interesting things that he said about summer parties is that it is work parties, we should bear in mind, is that it is perfectly acceptable to approach these parties in a transactional fashion. In other words, you can approach someone, speak to them for 3 or 4 minutes and engage in all sort of small talk, and then turn to them and say, I'm done talking to you now. I need to talk to somebody else now. In a personal setting, that might be considered slightly rude. In a professional setting, go for it.
Really, I found the whole article annoying. I thought it was too transactional. It wasn't. That's not what parties are. Charles, I host regular salons. As you know, you're always there. There's always plenty of food. There's lots of work and socialising, mixing together. Surely that's the way to do it.
This is the magic of Party Chez Georgina, and that is, while there are combinations of interesting professional people and people who have interesting personal backgrounds, it never, ever feels like work. It flows just as the wine
Charles.
does.
We're going to wrap you up there. Charles Hecker, Russia analyst and author of Zero Sum, The Arc of International Business in Russia. Thank you very much. You're with The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. President Donald Trump could meet Vladimir Putin as soon as next week, a White House official said yesterday. Such a face-to-face meeting would be the first between a sitting US and Russian president since Joe Biden met Putin in Geneva in June 2021, some 8 months before Russia launched the biggest attack on a European nation since World War II. South Korea and the United States will conduct major joint military drills starting on August the 18th, officials said, although they will delay parts of the annual exercise that have been a source of tension with North Korea to later in the year. The drills are due to be staged as the new South Korean government of President Lee Jae-myung seeks to improve strained ties with Pyongyang and revive stalled dialogue with its neighbour. And France has been hit by the largest wildfire since 1949. Firefighters are battling to control the country's biggest blaze in almost 80 years, and the fire has already swept through an area bigger than Paris. Spain and Portugal are also battling fires. Scientists say the Mediterranean region's hotter, drier summers heighten the risks. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now for a closer look behind the headlines. Here's Andrew Muller on the summer silly season in the British media.
One weekend, circa the summer of 1987, British tabloid The Sunday Express alarmed its readers with a story perfect for a cohort generally keen on cuddly animals, generally unkeen on the deviant abominations of odious foreigners. Beneath the headline, Poor El Condenado, the condemned one, waits for his fat killer, the Express waxed indignant over a bedraggled donkey scheduled to be ridden to collapse by some portly Spaniard during one of those depraved folk festivals that they have over there. To be clear, this is a Rococo paraphrasing of the Express's angle, not the views of Monocle, etc. Kelvin Mackenzie, then editor of The Sun, saw the potential for a great scoop and a grand lark. He dispatched star reporter Hugh Whitto to rescue the doomed animal. Whitto duly purchased the donkey, name of Blackie, for £250, about 725 quid in today's money, and persuaded a local farmer to look after the hapless creature overnight. The Sun splashed triumphantly with, "We save Blackie." The saga of Blackie the donkey, he died in Sidmouth Donkey Sanctuary in Devon in 1993, endures in the folklore of British journalism as perhaps the classic silly season story, but the idea of the silly season has deeper roots. London Weekly The Saturday Review employed the phrase as far back as 1861. Silly season means the summer months when politicians are on holiday, the royal family are pestering ruminants on the moorlands of Balmoral, the football is in abeyance, and celebrities whose antics can usually be relied on to fill a few pages are away absorbing Caribbean sun. Newspapers therefore had to make their own fun. Sightings of the Loch Ness Monster were always popular silly season fare. Delightfully, Scottish newspapers maintain the tradition. This year, the Inverness Courier, for one, carried a report of something long and thin spotted in the wake of a motorboat. Silly season no longer really exists as a discrete period. On social media especially, every season is silly season, nor does it help that Earth's most powerful individual is an incessant source of silliness which we are obliged to take seriously because of the office he holds. And newspaper travel budgets are not what they were. A shame, as Trump's tariffing of the blameless penguins off the Herndon McDonald Islands would once have prompted a sprint of chartered helicopters and headlines of the ilk of "Waddle they do" above pictures of some grinning hack planting his paper's flag on the beach. Legacy news media should re-embrace silly season. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Muller.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. It's 9:34 in Beirut, 8:34 in Zurich. Now, in Beirut, a seismic political decision has taken place which could result in a dramatic confrontation. The Lebanese government has instructed the army to restrict control of all weapons to the state by the end of the year, which would pave the way to disarm the powerful Iran-backed Hezbollah. Well, I'm joined now from Beirut by David Wood, who's a senior analyst for Lebanon at the International Crisis Group. David, many thanks for your time this morning. What exactly was decided at this cabinet meeting on Tuesday?
Hi, Georgina. So, as you pointed out, the headline from this cabinet meeting was that the Lebanese government has committed to disarm all non-state armed actors, including Hezbollah, of course, by the end of 2025. So, symbolically speaking, this kind of decision, it was just completely unimaginable as recently as 2 years ago, before the war between Israel and Hezbollah. But during that conflict, Israel weakened Hezbollah, not just militarily through its attacks, but also politically, because many of Israel's bombardments attacked communities that are aligned with Hezbollah and have created huge political costs for the party, even after the ceasefire was announced in November last year. So what it means is that Hezbollah is no longer in as strong a position to resist a kind of, let's say, hostile government decision like this. But then we think about it pragmatically, and that is the question of how will the Lebanese government actually go about implementing disarmament? And while Hezbollah may be weakened from before the war, it still retains tools within the system and outside the system to either disrupt or even derail the entire disarmament process.
So there was a very strong reaction from Hezbollah's Secretary General. What did he say?
So we've seen that even as the cabinet meeting was going on, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, Naim Asim, reiterated that Hezbollah does not want to lay down its weapons. And in fact, it first wants Israel to cease its violations of the ceasefire agreement of last November, which are its continued occupation of certain points in southern Lebanon and its near daily aerial attacks on Lebanon, before Hezbollah will consider entering discussions about disarming throughout the country. And we also saw that Hezbollah released an official statement yesterday saying that it will simply treat this cabinet decision on Tuesday as if it doesn't exist. So clearly Hezbollah has not changed its stance publicly and continues to refuse to disarm.
Now, there's a clear sense of heightened tension in Beirut with pro-Hezbollah demonstrations taking place. I wonder if you could describe the domestic atmosphere and the potential for further instability.
So certainly there's been heightened tension because this is a momentous decision and it was always going to receive pushback from Hezbollah. But I think also we should probably place those tensions in context. So in 2008 in Lebanon in May, there were week-long clashes after a decision by the government at the time to tear up Hezbollah's telecommunications network. Now, the then leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, came on TV and said this is a declaration of war against Hezbollah as an organization. And there were armed clashes in Beirut and other parts of the country for about a week. Now, sure, we've seen that in certain parts of Lebanon, there have been pro-Hezbollah demonstrations with guys on motorbikes and who are unhappy about the cabinet decision. But I think there's been nowhere near the same level of tension as existed in 2008. And that is because, as we were saying earlier, Hezbollah is in a much weaker position militarily and politically. So for that reason, even in its statement yesterday, Hezbollah on the one hand said it won't accept this decision, but on the other, there's a real emphasis from the leadership for Hezbollah supporters to maintain their patience and maintain their calm. And I think this is part of a broader strategy from Hezbollah to, wherever possible in the ceasefire period, try to minimize and avoid confrontation with the Lebanese state.
So what do you think this means in the long term for Lebanon's security and the regional dynamics?
So I know that Naim Asim, with his speech on Tuesday, really raised eyebrows by talking about potentially resuming military attacks on Israel, and this phrase that rockets will rain down on Israel if Israel expands its attacks on Lebanon. But I think that, as we were discussing, Hezbollah has really tried to adopt a non-confrontational approach on the domestic scene in Lebanon. And we know, for example, that Hezbollah approved the election of Joseph Aoun, the new Lebanese president, and the new government, both of which have said that they want to implement a state monopoly on arms. And now we know by the end of this year. So Hezbollah is in a position, I think, where it doesn't want to spark confrontation. And it also knows on top of that, that if it is to fire like a serious rocket attack against Israel, that Israel will respond with disproportionate force, just like it did during the recent war, and that disproportionate force will come down like a hammer, not just on Hezbollah as an organization, but probably also the communities in which many of its supporters live. I think what really worries me more in terms of Lebanon's stability moving forward would be if Israel simply loses its patience with the pace of disarmament and decides that rather than allowing the Lebanese state to deal with this problem, it will take matters into its own hands.
David, thank you. David Wood there of the International Crisis Group in Beirut. This is Monocle Radio. Little capsule toys are a common sight at fairgrounds the world over. But in Japan, the small toys that come out of special vending machines remain a major industry for children and adults alike. Celebrating 60 years of their arrival in Japan, the so-called Gacha Gacha exhibition in Tokyo features 11 manufacturers and 5 creators who've contributed to the development of Japan's capsule toy industry over the past 6 decades. Monocle's Ryuma Takahashi visited the exhibition and spoke with Ono O Katsuhiko, founder of Japan's Gacha Gacha Association, about the history and future of the Gacha Gacha business.
From tiny character toys to detailed portable toilet miniatures, even ID photos of complete strangers, Japan's capsule toy industry is said to produce over 300 new unique products every month. Known as Gacha Gacha in Japanese, capsule toy culture came to Japan from America 60 years ago. To mark this 60th anniversary, the Gacha Gacha exhibition is running in Marunouchi building in Tokyo. I spoke with Katsuhiko Ono, founder of the Japan Gacha Gacha Association and the organizer of this event.
The Gacha Gacha exhibition stems from my desire to pass down this Gacha Gacha culture, which has now become part of Japanese culture to future generations. These products themselves originally came from America, but there's always been an underlying Japanese culture of collecting and cherishing small things. Now it's interesting that even adult women are purchasing capsule toys. And this exhibition's concept is about wanting to understand and connect with these people. The market size in 2024 was about 824 million euros, and 2022 was about 359 million euros. So it's almost doubled. When I joined the Gacha Gacha industry 30 years ago, it was about 59 million euros. It's an infrastructure business. There are about 800,000 Gacha Gacha machines in Japan. Naturally, some locations will stop selling and get eliminated. But because it's an infrastructure business, it will never disappear completely.
According to Ono, Japan's capsule toy industry is currently experiencing its 4th wave of popularity. In the 1980s, major toy manufacturer Bandai entered the market, rising prices from around 10 yen to 100 yen products. The 1990s saw machine innovation that enabled 200 yen products, improving quality and dramatically increasing adult target items. The 2000s brought even higher priced products that became popular on social media. Until now, the industry has evolved by targeting adults alongside higher pricing. The current fourth wave is driven by the rise of gacha specialty stores, he says.
During COVID, many stores closed in shopping malls. When malls needed to fill vacant spaces, gacha specialty stores moved in because they require minimal labor and setup costs. In 2025, there are about 1,300 such stores in Japan. Previously, gacha was just individual vending machines. Now specialty stores consolidate around 1,000 machines in one location and use social media marketing, making them much more efficient.
Gacha is no longer unique to Japan, expanding overseas, particularly across Asia. Ono believes that overseas cashless payment culture might drive the next innovation.
Taiwan, China and Korea are also experiencing gacha booms, with many specialty stores opening. However, these countries have cashless cultures, so the traditional coin-operated culture hasn't really taken root. Bandai, the leading toy manufacturer, is developing smart gacha, cashless machines. Currently, we can only offer products up to 500 yen due to machine constraints. But this industry has always innovated with price increases, and I believe cashless technology could be the turning point.
What really drives this industry is the passion of creators and planners who keep improving quality as prices go up. Ono, who has been leading the industry for over 30 years, talked about what makes gacha so appealing.
For me, the appeal of gacha goes back to its origins, watching children use their own pocket money to turn the handle and experience both joy and disappointment. That truly makes me happy, especially when it's my own product. I believe all creators feel the same way, which is why we all strive for quality and never compromise on our products.
For Monocle in Tokyo, I'm Ryuma Takahashi.
Thanks, Ryuma, and that exhibition runs until the 15th of August. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
With UBS, you have a truly global partner, incorporating new technologies, innovative approaches, and unexpected opportunities, leading you to insights that help answer the questions that matter, delivered with passion, care, and unmatched expertise. Because it's about rising with the dawn each day, knowing that we can do even better. That's what banking is to us. Not just work, but a craft. UBS. Banking is our craft.
Now let's get the latest environmental news with Sheena Rossiter, Monocle's contributing editor in Edmonton. Sheena, we've been reporting in our headlines today about this enormous wildfire in France. What more can you tell us?
Well, it's grown to be the size of the city of Paris, and it's the biggest wildfire that France has experienced, and it's been spreading quickly since Wednesday. It's down in the Mediterranean region near Spain, and it's already left one person dead who died in their home, and several people have been injured. The military has been called in, and French Prime Minister François Bayrou has said that this disaster is of quote, unprecedented scale in the region. They have deployed over 2,100 firefighters and several water bomber aircrafts to help battle this blaze that broke out on Tuesday afternoon in the rural wooded area, which is typically home to a lot of wineries in the country. So this week's fire has really been the biggest since the creation of the National Fire Database in France. It's the biggest they've had on record, according to the National Emergency Service. And it's expected that the more we speak about climate and the more we speak about climate change, scientists have continued to warn that climate change is only making things like heat, dryness, which essentially is fuel for these fires, just that dry and hot weather. And this is just a bunch of wildfires that have been happening across Europe as the continent continues to suffer from blistering summer heat.
And of course, fire's not the only threat to human existence. We're now told that chemical pollution is comparable to climate change. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, this has been something that has always kind of popped up in the headlines periodically over the years. You've seen things like documentaries about how bad Teflon is on your cookware and stuff like that. But now there's a new piece of research or report that came out of the Deep Science Ventures that have gone as far as saying chemical pollution is, quote, a threat to the thriving of humans and nature of a similar order to that of climate change, end quote. And but the problem is it's decades behind the research that we have for global heating, and it just doesn't have the same concern in the public zeitgeist. So just to kind of give you an idea, in our industrialized economy, we've created hundreds of millions of these chemicals that are found in everything that we pretty much use in kind of commercial production, according to the report. And there's just an increasing growing body of evidence that this level of chemical toxicity really affects us and our health in many ways. Everything from ADHD to infertility to things like cancer that people are suffering from because of all these chemicals that are found in so many products that we see all the time.
So what's the solution?
Well, some of the basic solutions, one of the biggest ones is that you could basically eat more organic food. Of course, that's not always accessible to everyone, but at very least you should be washing your fruits and veggies a little bit more to get away from some of these chemicals and pesticides that we experience a lot in our foods. And one really basic one, which seems very basic, is just heat up your food in non-plastic Tupperware or something like that. So avoid plastics in that respect in terms of heating up the food. And if you could avoid simply using Teflon cookware, which is really difficult these days because that's found in a lot of cookware that we all use.
I mean, I had no idea that Teflon was bad for you.
Oh, yes, it is. It is really not good for you.
And nor is green algae, it turns out. So I have a very active dog that loves swimming, and we go and swim on the heath almost every day. And increasingly, there are various ponds we have to avoid because they're closed, because this algae is so dangerous for living creatures. Tell us more about it.
Yeah, so speaking of climate change, researchers here in Canada out of the University of McGill in Montreal, they started to really dig for answers in the sediment of a lot of Canadian lakes, and research that they've recently published in the Communications, Earth and Environmental Journal suggests that the growth of green algae in Canadian lakes in particular has increased 7-fold since the 1960s. And this is in big part due to climate change because of excess things like nitrogen, phosphorus, and it just keeps growing, this green algae, and then it gets carried through our waterways. Of course, algae is good. It is a good bacteria to a certain extent. It is an essential food for aquatic habitats, but just too much algae is a bad thing. And it also infects people, and as you mentioned with your dog, you can't really go swimming in a lot of areas. So with this latest research that has come out here in Canada, they're basically going to keep an eye on it, and local authorities are going to keep monitoring the growth of algae, but this is something that they now know is being triggered by climate change.
And it's also the runoff from things like animal manure and fertilizers and so on?
Exactly. So this is just, so aside from climate change, nitrogen and manure and just general things that happen in the waterways, like you mentioned with fertilizers, wastewater and stormwater, those are also contributing factors. So of course, this research doesn't just exist in a vacuum, but the research does explain that climate change is one of the factors that has led to this 7-fold increase of algae.
Sheena, thank you very much indeed. That's Sheena Rossiter there, Monocle's contributing editor in Edmonton. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. it's August, which means almost every email I send to a European-based contact bounces back with an automatic out-of-office reply. This is the month where seemingly the whole continent decamps en masse for vacation. But not so in the US, where the work ethic has always been strong, reinforced recently by Donald Trump's remarks that there are too many holidays, though the ones he wants to abolish are mostly bound up with celebrating diversity, so that could just be racism and nothing to do with productivity. But younger generations of Americans are re-evaluating their work-life balance, and it seems they're coming round to the European way of prizing quality of life. Well, I'm joined now by Monocle's senior news editor, Chris Chermak. Chris, before we get into it, the rudeness of an out-of-office automatic reply. Don't you think? I think they're terrible things.
Can I just say, on a sort of personal note, you can imagine how challenging it is to actually book a show like this when you're trying to invite guests on in August and you get those automatic replies saying, I'm gone for a few weeks. I had one interesting one the other day from an office. I won't name the office, that simply said, for the entirety of August, we're down to like 4 hours a day. I believe it was in Finland somewhere. So that was another way to do it. Instead of just taking off, like your entire office is just on 4 hours a day.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's policy here that we don't actually put an out of office on at Monocle ever.
We have actually updated that a little bit, but we always put now sort of who you should contact, who you can contact instead. But yes, limited use of the out of office, because otherwise it can get a bit ridiculous.
Yeah, well, that brings us on to work, because I think, and we've seen this in real life, when you work in the media, you can't say it's 5 o'clock, I'm going home, can you?
You
if there's a breaking news story, you stay.
This is why I'm here, Georgina, to talk about the quality of life and work in the United States, because yes, here in the media, even in August, we have a show to put together. We can't go. I mean, some of us do, and we still allow ourselves to take a vacation, and that's what we'll get into. It's important to actually have some time to take vacation, so that does matter. But yes, we work through it at the same time.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the US sort of culture of work. They've got the second lowest number of paid holiday days and the fewest leave days of any nation on the planet.
Well, they do, and none of that is legally required. So that's the thing that is so exceptional of the US. There is no statutory paid leave in the United States. The average is around just over 10 days, maybe 12 days, which itself is quite low. And even that, it is not a requirement. By comparison, in Europe, typically there is a requirement, a statutory requirement for you to get around 20 days off. That's typically what you get here in Europe. So yes, there is a massive difference even today on just how the government approaches it to begin with.
But Americans' attitude to work has been changing over the generations, and younger Americans want something quite different now. They're more interested in quality of life.
It has been changing. There's obviously that cliche, if you want, of previous generations that kind of focused on work, whether it was sort of your grandparents' generation that simply needed to make money and sort of survive, and then your parents' generation that kind of worked, particularly in the US, I think, to have a good life for themselves, the baby boomer generation, if you will. And what's interesting when you, I think, compare Europe to the US on this is that in you might have always had, my father, my Austrian father would talk about, well, work is work. Like, you don't need to get enjoyment out of work necessarily. But you took vacations in Europe at the very least. In the US, you didn't really take the vacations. You didn't travel as much. There was more of the focus on the family and the community. Now, this is, I think, what is changing in the US as well, that the younger generations want to take vacations. They want to have time off of work to get away from where they live. And that's a big change I think you haven't seen from previous generations.
And what's driving that? Is it inspired by Europe, or was it prompted by COVID?
I think it's a mix, but a lot of it in some ways was inspired by COVID because, of course, COVID led to a certain amount of remote working in the United States. And with that came a bit more of an appreciation of quality of life, moving to places where perhaps not being right in the center of the city, moving to places where you had a better quality of life. And then, yes, being able to take vacations. Now, what's interesting with this is because of the statutory requirements and how work typically treats this in the US, one of the ways that millennials go about this is what's called quiet vacationing, which basically is not telling your boss that you're going on vacation, right? We shouldn't say this too loudly here at Monocle. But the idea is there's a survey from this year that 4 in 10 millennials plan to take quiet vacations this year, and they can do that because of the remote work. More than 20% of Americans work remotely now, 2/3 in an industry like the tech sector. So they're doing quiet vacationing. And what's sad about it, I think, in the US is they're doing that instead of asking for work time off. Often they would be allowed to take the work time off, but there's this competitive atmosphere in the US which doesn't allow you to do that, makes you worry about, are you going to keep your job? Are you going to get ahead of the next guy? That still hasn't really changed in the US, even if they're taking vacation.
Chris, many thanks. I wonder how this plays out for people who are extremely vocal about how hard they graft, but are often found on golf courses during the working week, sometimes courses even named after themselves.
I don't know. I can't imagine who you're talking about there, Georgina. Not one bit.
Chris Jermack, thanks for joining us. And if discussion around quality of life interests you, and you wouldn't be listening unless they did, then why not sign up for our conference from the 4th to the 6th of September in Barcelona? Details on our website. That's it from me. Thanks to our producers, Chris Jermack and Laura Kramer, our researcher, Henry King, and our studio manager, Elliot Greenfield. The briefing will be live at midday in London, and the Globalists will return at the same time tomorrow. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.